For the content of today's talk, I'd like to thank colleagues, primarily my colleagues who are musicologists and work on Mexican music history. And they include Yael Bitran, John Lassos, who lives actually not so far away in Canada, close by, and Ricardo Miranda, and Fernando Carrasco V, and then two other colleagues based in the United States. They are Candace Bailey and Elizabeth Morgan, all of whom have contributed to the development of this particular part of my research and that I'm going to present and share with you all for today. The presentation also includes recordings of music published in 1847. And so I'd like to thank Dr. Charbel Ubaile, who's the pianist that you'll hear performing on the recordings, Paul Hope, who's the narrator, and then Omar Herrera, who was a very important consultant in identifying musicians who could collaborate with me in recording the music that I'm speaking about today. And then finally, many thanks to my graduate students who are taking my music and trauma seminar this semester. I presented to them a shorter version of this paper about 3 weeks ago, and so they provided me with great feedback, which of course I've incorporated here. My larger project, which is on the long 19th century, Latin music and dance, the history of Latin music and dance in the United States, in and around the United States. I've been pursuing since 2016, essentially. But this particular paper, which is focusing on essentially 2 days in 1847 during the Mexican War, is a part of this larger project that is ongoing. I should also then, before I get started, is to say that, or to give a content warning of at least one photograph that depicts a crying child detained at the border. So if you feel like you need to excuse yourself for any reason at any point during the talk, please do so. So the talk itself, it lasts about 40 minutes. Okay. On March 28th, 1847, on the eve of the outbreak of hostilities between Mexico and the United States, U.S. General Zachary Taylor's army of fewer than 4,000 soldiers advanced to the northern banks of the Rio Grande River opposite the Mexican city of Matamoros. There, a volunteer private in a Tennessee regiment of cavalry named George C. Ferber described the actions of the Mexican army upon the U.S. Army's arrival. The Mexican army was immediately drawn out on the other side of the river, he wrote, in long and imposing columns, but nothing was done by them save a great display of martial music, drums, fifes, trumpets, bugles, etc., which mode of salutation, whatever it meant, was answered in the same way by all the trumpets and drums in the American lines, so that the first meeting of the armies ended in noise. Published in 1848, soon after the end of the Mexican War, this soldier's memoir, titled The 12 Months Volunteer, and his memory of military music, which constituted the sonic outbreak before the outbreak of hostilities, frames my topic. Indeed, it brings the study of sound, music, and trauma of the Mexican War into conversation with what J. Martin Dougherty frames as the balafonic in his book, Listening to War, Sound, Music, Trauma, and Survival in Wartime Iraq, published in 2015. That is, the agglomeration of sounds that are generated by weaponry and vehicles, as well as sonic material that is less directly or conventionally associated with warfare, including human voices in or close to combat, live and recorded music, chants, and so on. And I saw that Martin Dougherty gave a presentation several years ago on this talk, so that was quite nice to see. Ferber's recollection of the balafonic sound created by the two armies as military bands, characterizing the results of the armies' confrontation as noise, represents what Dougherty argues as a fundamental dimension of wartime experience, often encompassing a profound source of trauma, giving one access to new forms of knowledge. True to this notion of the agglomeration of sound, music, and trauma in war, other primary sources from the Mexican War abound with the ballophonics about the battlefield, two of which I will focus on in this evening's lecture. Writing about La Batalla de Angostura, fought in the northern Mexican state of Coahuila on February 22nd and 23rd, 1847, Mexican poet Guillermo Prieto begins with the following stanza. And I'll be reading the poetry that's in its original Spanish, and I've included English translations on the slides for you. Lindas estrellas del norte claras estrellas, que en el fondo de los cielos me estáis contemplando trémulas. Contrast the looming disaster for General Santa Anna's Mexican army, hinted at in Prieto's opening stanza of his poem, Grande y Verifico Romance del Triste Gana Pierde, with the triumphant march from the Battle of Buena Vista, composed by German-American Charles Grobe, with narration taken from newspaper reports of the Battle of Buena Vista.
General Taylor, apprised of the Mexican approach, breaks up his camp at Agua Nuevo and takes post in a strong position at Buena Vista.
Set in poetry and in music by two artists, contemporaries of each other, and both secondary witnesses to the turning point in the Mexican War, this battle scene would end dramatically for Prieto and triumphantly for Grobe. What these artistic creations in their entirety also constitute are commemorations for soldiers who underwent traumatic experiences in a battle known as La Batalla de Angostura in Mexico and the Battle of Buena Vista in the United States. As commemorative pieces, they enabled Mexicans and U.S. Americans to reenact traumatic events in public and domestic settings, to honor those who fought and died for their nations. But what could such obscure or forgotten pieces today teach us about a battle fought 176 years ago? And how can poetry and music about this battle contribute new knowledge on the history of conflict that literary scholar Jaime Javier Rodriguez argues continues to this day, most visibly in the cycles of border militarization between Mexico and the United States? As commemorations of traumatic events go, Grobe's piece for piano, published 3 months after the battle, conforms not to historical accuracy as such, but to the ideological, political, and even commercial needs of its creator and audiences. The fact that Grobe's piece not only quotes the melody of the Mexican jarabe, El Perico, but also claims in the narrator's part that it was performed by Mexican military bands at the battle's outset, creates, as Elizabeth Morgan has noted in other pieces about the Mexican War, a diegetic soundtrack, thus contributing to the listener's reception of the music a feeling of historical immediacy and testimony of the Battle of Buena Vista. Although it was apparently not published until 1895, Prieto's poem reads with similar historical immediacy and testimony, conveyed in Grobe's music to include saying as well that military music filled the space in which the battle was fought. Both artistic creations, along with archival sources, indicate that Mexico's military bands indeed played music not only at the outset of hostilities in 1846, but at most, if not all, battles, including at Angostura. While U.S. American composers published dozens, if not hundreds, of piano pieces about the major battles of the Mexican War, very few Mexican composers did the same. One exception, the score for which Mexican musicologists and historians I've consulted, nor have I yet to obtain, is La Gran Batalla de la Angostura, reportedly composed by Luis Pérez de León and premiered in 1854 at the National Palace of Mexico City. I would attribute this relative absence of published Mexican music about the war to the problems of remembering and forgetting that characterize, as musicologist Philip Bullman notes, boundary regions and border conflicts, those areas of the map in which it is most difficult to lay claim to place. I argue that Mexico's musical silencing of the nation's disastrous defense at its northern border against the United States' invasion materializes in this musical forgetting. As Alejandro Madrid has written, from the perspectives of the cities of central Mexico, the northern Mexican border was a site of barbarism, populated by uncivilized and nomadic indigenous groups. For 19th century Mexicans, Madrid writes, the northern borderlands were literally an unstable site of contention. I further argue that Groves and other piano pieces of the Battle of Buena Vista ensound silenced pasts of both Mexico's traumatic history of the war and the United States' own trauma silenced by the bellophonics of Manifest Destiny. As Marissa Fuentes does in reading the violent archival accounts of enslaved black women, I listen with and against the bias grain to expand the oral legibility of forgotten music in order to accentuate the trauma of the Mexican War that continues to haunt the border to this day. I read Prieto's poems, which Jaime Javier Rodriguez calls invasion poems, as a lens through which to listen for the representational gaps and disarticulations that trauma induced in both Mexican and U.S. soldiers in the 1840s and that haunt border migrants and agents today. Indeed, if trauma is anti-archival by definition, as performance studies theorist Diana Taylor states, then these artistic creations of musical and poetic witnessing can make audible and legible that which is purged from the archive, but still haunts the memory regimes of Mexico and the United States. Reiterative histories, absent memories. As a memory regime par excellence, Manifest Destiny, as represented here in John Gass's painting American Progress from 1872, continues to profoundly shape the United States' collective understanding of the Mexican War. 8 years before the Battle of Buena Vista, John O'Sullivan wrote that the United States is destined to manifest to mankind the excellence of divine principles, to establish on earth the noblest temple ever dedicated to the worship of the Most High, the sacred and the true. And that's a quote. Mexico's own narratives of national destiny circulated at the same time, and often in contestation to political events unfolding in its northern provinces. Writing in 1845, on the cusp of the United States' annexation of the Republic of Texas, Manuel Peno offered his own assessment of Mexico's loss of Texas. El plan del gobierno español era dejar un inmenso desierto entre la raza española y la anglosajona. In the absence of populating Texas with Mexicans, he added, Texas's flowing rivers were left to serve only las tribus errantes de indios, or errant Indian tribes. Quote. Undergirding these national narratives of destiny, centered on unstable and contested borderlands, was a sense of racialized anxiety. While Mexican writers viewed their concern over Mexico's standing as a nation through the lenses of Hispanophilia or Hispanophobia, white U.S. writers tended to view Mexicans through the lens of Anglo-Saxonism, often referring to Mexicans as a mongrel race, and to the geopolitical tensions with Mexico in the West as the coming war of races. More than commemorating battles fought in the Mexican War, we might also consider piano battle music like Grobe's as non-diegetic and diegetic soundtracks to this so-called War of Races, orally and textually revealing the specters of horror and trauma unfolding as national destinies, as well as borders were being realized or devastated on the battlefield. Writing on music commemorating the Holocaust, Amy Wolodarski theorizes musical witnessing as a genre of musical expression defined by its aesthetic criteria and cultural consequences. Musical witness infers the possibility of immediate contact by embodying a dialogical relationship between art, history, and memory, though the creators themselves are removed from the trauma. I'd like to expand back in time the musical witness Wolodarski writes about, and to include poetic witnesses of the Mexican War as sites and acts of translation and transformation dependent on creative generic conventions, forms, and idioms associated with the testimonial act, modes, and media of memory. And this is just a quick outline or summary of the three ways in which Wolodarski conceives of musical witness. First, as a noun that embodies not only the artist, but the artwork itself and the audience of the artist and the artwork. Then, as a transitive verb, that is the act of memory. So in creating a piano piece or in writing a poem, it's enacting this memory for audiences, recreating for these experiences for their respective audiences. I think factuality, too, is an important part of it, even though, again, Grobe and Prieto, neither Grobe or Prieto were actually there at the battle, of course. And then finally, genre. So musical witnessing as a genre that entails the performative aspects of witnessing, which much of my analysis will unpack in these two pieces. And again, the end result conveying accuracy and authority. As mentioned earlier, Charles Grobe consulted newspapers for reports of the war's battles as source material for his piano battle music. For the narrator's part in the Battle of Buena Vista, he likely used a report published in or reprinted from the Louisville Daily Courier of April 7, 1847. In terms of its generic conventions, Grobe's piece is through composed, the musical scenes of which unfold through the tonal areas of G major, C major, F major, and its relative D minor, C major again, C minor, and C major once more. The piece also follows Grobe's compositional formula, which Anne L. Willett and Charles S. Willett explain he developed to meet his teaching needs and the tastes of the genteel households that bought pianos and sheet music in vast quantities. His piano pieces emphasize a right-hand melody and make use of limited harmonic resources and basic metrical rhythms. Indeed, Grobe's The Battle of Buena Vista follows what Annegret Fauser traces as a musical topoi characteristic of piano battle music from the late 18th century through the 19th and up until World War I. Such topoi include mimetic renderings of cannons and bombs, along with martial sounds. Grobe's use of the melody from the Mexican jarabe El Perico for the first C major section of the piece was also consistent with his regular use of popular melodies from opera, sacred, and patriotic music. Let's listen to this part of the piece.
The Mexicans appear immediately in front of the American forces, their bands playing their favorite march, Perico.
What is unusual here is that the report published in the Louisville Daily Courier makes no mention of Mexican military bands at all, suggesting that Grobe drew from multiple accounts of the battle as source material. But how did he know El Perico? And what can we take from its inclusion in this music's witnessing of the battle? First, Grobe might have had access to a collection of piano arrangements of Mexican songs titled Colección de 24 Canciones y Jarabes Mexicanos, which was published in Hamburg, Germany, around 1830. And there you have the cover of that edited volume there from 1830. This collection includes a piano arrangement of El Perico. To begin to understand the significance of this moment of Grobe's piece, I return to Prieto's invasion poem, Grande y Verifico, Romance Letriste, Gana Pierde. Prieto's poem is structured in 4 parts, titled in order, Aquí empieza, Antes de la batalla, Marcha a la Angostura, and La batalla. The poem's 3rd part, Marcha a la Angostura, starts by describing his painful memories of the battle that would end in horrific death. Oh memorias doloridas que cruzáis por el pasado, como bandada de cuervos. Prieto becomes poetic witness in his act of remembering. Then, Prieto describes the terribly supplied Mexican soldiers bringing the past into the present. Así recuerdo la marcha de aquel ejército bravo que caminó a la Angostura, con hambre, con sed, descalzo, casi desnudos, lo unos, otros muchos desarmados, y multitud de infelices recogidos en los campos. He concludes this section, however, by announcing in the present tense the Mexican army's arrival on the battlefield playing martial music. Nuestros clarines resuenan, se despierta el entusiasmo, se elevan nuestras banderas, el gozo incendia los ánimos, los vivas pueblan los aires, relinchan nuestros caballos y las músicas marciales vuelan llenando el espacio. More than merely playing their favorite march, as Grobe's narration states, the Mexican army's buglers in Prieto's poetic witnessing resound and awaken the ill-supplied Mexican soldiers to cheer with excitement. Even their horses excites the air with their neighs, all of which engenders empathy and conveys accuracy and authority. From the 1820s through the 1840s, the Mexican military closely regimented the use of bugles, cornets, trumpets, drum majors, and fifes, and assigned these instruments according to a unit's type: dragoons, cavalry, grenadiers, artillery, horse brigades, engineers, and riflemen. Whether as part of militias or the regular army, Mexican military bands performed symphonic pieces, opera arias, music from zarzuelas, and popular dance music such as valses, polkas, and jarabes, in addition to marches, doing so at parks, plazas, and gardens for the public, as well as on the battlefield. The military band's performance of music at the Battle of Angostura captured the imagination of other U.S. composers besides Grobe, including W.C. Peters and William Rattle, both of whom published piano pieces titled Santa Anna's March. The inscription on the title page of Rattle's piece states, "This beautiful air was brought on by some Kentucky volunteers, having heard it played by the Mexican bands at Buena Vista while on sentry duty." In consulting Mexican and U.S. reports, including maps of the battlefield, I traced the musical sounds reportedly transcribed by Kentuckian soldiers to the eastern hillside overlooking the narrow pass of Angostura, where regiments of Mexican and U.S. light infantry set up positions in close proximity to each other at the start of the battle on the evening of February 22nd. And see, there you have pointed right on this, the eastern side of this mountainous pass called Angostura, where where the Mexican military band would have played and reportedly transcribed by a Kentuckian soldier, which is actually, if you think about it, and when I read that first, although hard to document historically, it was fascinating to think that a soldier would actually either remember the tune, reimagine it, write it down, or perhaps even write it down in the battle. I don't know. So let's listen to the first minute of Rattle's Santa Ana's March. Charles Grove's musical witnessing of the start of the battle's balafonics conveys a sense of rushed maneuvers with ascending and descending playing in the right hand that includes chromatic movement.
The enemy attempts to turn the American left flank. Sherman's and Bragg's batteries ordered to the left. Colonel Bissell takes position between them, and the Kentuckians, under Colonel McKee, move from the right to the center. The artillery of both armies opens its fire.
Prieto's representation of the commencement of firing conveys a similar sense of tense purpose on the part of Mexican soldiers. And like Grove naming U.S. American officers, Prieto names the Mexican officer Luis Gonzaga Osoyo accordingly. Ahí, Luis Gonzaga Osoyo y otros nobles oficiales, circundados por la gloria, fueron en la lid gigantes, la noche compadecida, del cielo quiso lanzarse, para dar propicio aliento a los que ardientes se baten, pero al extender sus alas, con entusiasmo vibrante, oyó gritar en la tierra y oyó tronar en los aires. Las vivas a nuestras tropas, odiando el cero triunfantes. At this point, the first day of fighting paused, and the night in the wintry desert of northern Mexico was cold and wet with rain. According to the Mexican newspaper El Republicano, la noche fue horrorosa, como precursora de las grandes desgracias que a otro día lloraría la humanidad. Frío, lluvia, aire furioso, sed, hambre, fatiga, todo abrumaba al soldado mexicano. Forgotten trauma. The extreme cold of the night of February 22nd was not only a precursor to the violence of the next day's battle, it was a continuation of weeks of extreme conditions experienced by General Santa Anna's soldiers, who had marched approximately 250 miles for 25 days from San Luis Potosí to stop General Taylor's invading army at Angostura. From February 3rd to the 4th, strong winds from the north blew and a cold rain fell. This was followed by hot weather and lack of sufficient water for the Mexican soldiers and their families who followed. By February 11th, bitterly cold weather returned, which was corroborated by a Kentuckian soldier reporting from Saltillo. By the time the Mexican army arrived at Encarnacion on February 21st, they had lost 4,000 men to death, sickness, fatigue, and to desertion, reducing their total numbers from 18,000 to 14,000 soldiers. Prieto concludes the second section of his poem, titled Antes de la Batalla, accordingly. Así, al faltar los recursos por las contiendas de México, el hambre entró en los cuarteles. En San Luis, el descontento. En las almas asomaban fatales presentimientos. In narrating the second and decisive day of the battle, Prieto writes in the perfect present tense to describe the reverberations or balphonics of the brutal fighting, creating in his poetry a wash of violent sounds that join black smoke, the blood cries of dying soldiers, and the sound of a bugle in filling the landscape's hills and crevices. Ya trepando o descendiendo de las lomas por las grietas, como entre olas de humo negro, se ven flotar las banderas y el acero de las armas en ráfagas reverbera, corre la sangre a torrentes, los bronces gimiendo truenan, los ayes de los heridos, el insulto, la blasfemia, el trueno, el clarín, los vivas, en tumulto el aire llenan. Then, another point of confluence in some reports occurs at a critical point of the battle, described in one Mexican source as el fuego de las piezas que la componen la batería del capitán Vallarta ocasiona a los contrarios pérdidas de consideración. Todos los tiros se aprovechan por a la inmediata. Los americanos, que han soñando un momento con la victoria, se retiran destrozados, quedando el campo cubierto con los cadáveres confundidos de los valientes que por ambas partes han caído en esta sangrienta lucha. The Louisville Daily Courier explains that at this critical moment, the Indiana regiment turned upon its proper front and commenced an inglorious flight. These apparent inactions of the Indiana regiment, represented by the Louisville Daily Courier as inglorious or cowardly, were later the focus of a court inquiry. Reporting on this inquiry suggests that the Indiana regiment's officer, Colonel Bowles, erroneously ordered a retreat. Grobe, however, chose to leave the Indiana regiment's retreat out of his music's narration, erasing from this commemorative piece what surely must have been a traumatic moment for these Indiana soldiers. Instead, his music narrates a heroic sequence of advances by U.S. soldiers, culminating in the U.S. carrying, quote, death and destruction into the swarming columns of the Mexicans.
General Taylor advises Captain Bragg to supply the enemy with a little more grape. The American artillery carries death and destruction into the swarming columns of the Mexicans, causing them to roll like the billows of the ocean. The Mexicans falter, they give way, and are seen flying by regiments in terror and dismay, pursued by the light troops of the American army, whilst the shouts of the victors are heard above the thunder of the artillery.
For the piece's finale, Grobe concludes his role as musical witness and ultimately musical narrator of Manifest Destiny by praising the heroic U.S. officers of the Battle of Buena Vista and proclaiming to the world on their behalf that the, quote, free men of America are yet, as they ever have been, invincible.
The names of Taylor, Wool, Bragg, Vell, O'Brien, Clay, Fry, Hardin, McKee, Lincoln, Washington, Lane, Marshall, May, Rucker, Campbell, Pike, Field, Crittenden, Monroe, Sherman, Steen, Gorman, Trail, Davis, Bowles, Bissell, Connor, and many more shall be written as with characters of gold in the bright record of their country's history, to which, by their gallant achievements, they have added another bright page. All honor, gratitude, and glory to the American heroes who nobly periled their lives and shed their blood in defense of their country's rights, and by their deeds proclaimed to the world that the free men of America are yet, as they ever have been, invincible.
Prieto, too, penultimately concludes his role as poetic witness by praising the heroic Mexican officers of la batalla de Angostura. Y aquí, blancos se distingue, allá Torrejón campea, más allá, tú conquistabas, ilustre Miquel Torena, brillantes lauros muy dignos, de honor y de fama eterna, como render homenaje y como ensalzar quisiera las hazañas de Parodi, de Lamborghini y Juvera. Tornó a desplegar la noche en el cielo su tiniebla, quedamos dueños del campo, y era la victoria nuestra. Prieto's final stanza, however, begins with the following: Pero Santa Ana, ligero, brusca retirada, ordena. But Santa Ana frivolously orders an abrupt retreat. In my essay, Trumpism and Hauntological Reckonings of Latinidad in Mexico, published in the Journal of the American Musicological Society's special issue on early American music and the construction of race, I write about ProPublica's 2018's recording of crying children separated from their parents inside a converted warehouse, Border Patrol detention facility in Texas. I frame the recorded sounds of the traumatized children and the Spanish-speaking U.S. border agent as conjuring 19th century histories of dehumanization at the hands of Anglo Manifest Destiny and Spanish and Mexican settler colonialism in North America. To listen to the crying of detained children today as a message from traumatized Mexican and indigenous pasts is to reckon with my own privileged life as a cisgender male Latino, a natural-born U.S. citizen, a tenured professor, and a member of the Scholarly Advisory Committee of the National Museum of the American Latino, or NAMAL. Has there ever been a time since the U.S. invasion of northern Mexico that the border was not militarized, or else was free of the war's traumatic aftermaths? Moreover, has Manifest Destiny's ideological hold on the United States' collective memory of the Mexican War waned in the present? In August 11, 2022, The Hill published an op-ed titled "The Smithsonian's Latino Exhibit is a Disgrace." Written by Alfonso Aguilar, Mike Gonzalez, and Joshua Trevino, the opinion piece characterizes the exhibit's Presente, a Latino History of the United States, put up by the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Latino, with familiar conservative buzzwords and dog whistles, including Marxist, leftist ideologies, celebrates transsexual activists, denigrates Christianity, denounces capitalism, condemns the West, oppressor-oppressed agenda, radical left agenda, and so on. To their credit, they make the aim of their op-ed clear: to convince Congress to defund NAMAL. For the purposes of this lecture, and by way of conclusion, I quote what the writers say about the exhibit's representation of the Mexican War. They write, among the tendentious or downright false assertions in the Latino exhibit are that the United States stole 1/3 of Mexico in 1848. In many ways, Prieto's invasion poem, Grande y Verifico, Romance del Triste, Gana y Pierde, and Grove's The Battle of Buena Vista serve complementary roles in recalling, for us today, a little over 176 years ago, La Batalla de Angostura. They both signal the respective nations' memory regimes of the war. That is, Mexican composers' silenced response to the war's disastrous outcome, on the one hand, and the traumatic reactions by U.S. soldiers from Indiana, characterized in the Louisville Daily Courier as an inglorious flight, on the other. Prieto's and Grove's works also represent mimetically the horrifying bellophonics of war, while conveying the notion of glory of the battles fallen. They emphasize the ritual music played on the battlefield. Perhaps most revealing, however, are the national destinies that Prieto's and Grove's artistic creations foretell of the current militarization in and around the border region between Mexico and the United States. Then, as is now, the border between the United States and Mexico is a contentious site of militarized surveillance, where national claims to place continue to separate children from their families, people from their individual destinies, and engender trauma and death. Although the relative absence of musical commemorations by Mexican composers signal a national forgetting of the defeat at Angostura, music making and listening did occur amidst the din, fear, and trauma of battle, the echoes of which haunt border walls and detention centers. Whether these lands were stolen or destined to be part of the United States, what U.S. Manifest Destiny is not configured to do is to consider the human costs of the war, costs that my analysis has attempted to make legible sonically, and that children and their families are paying for to this day. Thank you.
What's the role of Santa Anna in terms of well, for both sides, for the Mexican side and the American side, during this representation of trauma in music and poetry? What would be the difference in terms of the representation of this figure of Santa Anna?
Santa Anna, a controversial figure to say the least, both with respect from the perspective of the United States, but in most especially Mexico. I think, indeed, I think he embodies the disastrous defeat of Mexico from the Mexican perspective, both at the time, for most of Mexico anyway, and certainly historically, without a doubt. My understanding is that in addition to having not fed his soldiers for 2 or 3 days, which is the reason why he gave to retreat and to leave in the middle of the night after the second day of the battle, and took the rest of the army with him. He was then headed back to the city where he was called to become president yet again. So yeah, he was just this conflicting figure throughout basically his time as a politician and also a soldier, of course, going back a couple of decades even before the war. So in many ways, I think if what you were alluding to, in many ways he did embody so much of the trauma, honestly, of Mexican history of the 19th century, to include of the Mexican War, if that answers your question. Yeah.
First, thank you for coming and giving us this amazing presentation. My question is, do you think the representation of trauma through sound and music is still similar right now in the border between Mexico and the United States? And if it is, what's the difference between both sides? I know a little bit about the Mexican side, but I'm not sure how it is represented in American music.
Thank you for that great question, and it makes me think of, and I would love to hear about your the music that you've heard that from Mexican music that represents and talks about and documents the trauma of the border region. And I must credit one of my students from my graduate seminar, Music and Trauma, who's focusing on a Tori Amos song about the La Maquiladoras of Juarez. So these are for several decades in the late 20th century and into the 21st century, women were disappeared from the factories of northern Mexico, most especially in Juarez. And their bodies, when they were discovered and found, were often found out in the desert. And so Tori Amos recorded a song about this these violent murders of women at the time. And so the question that the student and us collectively are asking ourselves is sort of who gets to represent these kinds of traumas, especially given the history of U.S. and Mexico and a U.S. white American woman representing the trauma of this very most recent historical event. These are important questions to ask. I think there are many ways to unpack, to include sound. And I'm not remembering the actual title of the piece. Maybe someone can Google it quickly. But if you, and so that you can maybe listen to it if you're not familiar with it. One of the sonic aspects I'm recalling from when we listened to it together in seminar was this sort of high-pitched percussive metallic beat that plays through much of the track, which to many of us seem to represent La Maquiladoras, the factory work, sort of this sort of mechanization of factory work, repetitive, going on through what otherwise the story that she's telling about the disappeared and murdered women in her song. I don't know if you have anything that you would like to share.
Okay, maybe it's not going to be very helpful, but there's another song who talks about violence against women and disappeared women. It's Canción Sin Miedo de Villar Quintanilla, and it talks exactly about what you're describing, specifically about after Las Muertas de Juárez. So I don't know if it's going to be helpful for your grad student.
So Canción Sin Miedo, so Song Without Fear. Yeah. And who was the artist's name?
Vivir Quintana. Sí, Vivir Quintana con El Palomar, which is like a choir made out of Mexican wood.
Thank you so much. I will share that.
Actually, if I could ask a question,
yes.
Have you found any kind of representation of this battle or the larger in indigenous expressive arts?
I have not, Harry, and I think that's the one area that I know that I need to, or that I know I want to try to discover. So some hints at this, why it's important. In the aftermath of La batalla de Angostura, so right after February and through the rest of the year, in going through historical newspaper databases, including Mexican publications, as well as U.S. military publications published in Mexico as occupiers, including one that's titled, newspaper, The Anglo-Saxon, so I need to unpack that. That'll be part of the larger version, what I hope will be an article version of this paper. But in many of these articles, there is constant reference to indigenous tribes and people, raiders, etc. You get this very common discourse of the 19th century about the violent and dangerous Indians, but again, both from Mexican reporting as well as U.S. reporting. And that's a part of the story that in the first iteration of the abstract to this paper, I was intending to make that a part of the paper, but I just simply need to do more of that research to add it to what's already here. It's an important part of how I'm conceiving of this long 19th century history of U.S. Latino music, right? Is that, and I talk about this in the JAMS article, and I mentioned it here, is it's not only or merely about in this case, Manifest Destiny, it's also the history of Spanish settler colonialism, genocide, and slavery, as well as early Mexican settler colonialism and all that. So bringing in all of those histories together in my analysis is, I think, for myself, as a scholar, but also as a Latino, as a crucial part of my work moving forward. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Thanks, David. This was very interesting and really fun to be exposed to this kind of music, which we tend to often overlook because it's, not grand symphonic, anything like that. And I was hoping you could tell us a bit more about what you might know about the performance context of the Groba piece, the piano piece, whether it was specifically for home performance, whether it was performed in public, because it strikes me as being very similar to the sort of earlier 19th century European phenomenon of the melodrama, as we're going to speak and like semi-act, but also try and evoke the senses through music that, again, often escapes scholarly attention because it is sort of simplistic and accessible to amateur performers. So anything you know about how this was performed would be fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. Elizabeth Morgan has done this work, both, especially a piano battle music of the Civil War. Wonderful, important work. But she also has a piece recently, just published in this past December in, I think it's the 19th Century Music, Journal of 19th Century Music, on piano battle music of the Mexican War, including Charles Groves' pieces. And what Elizabeth Morgan, among other things, teaches us is that this piano battle music was mostly for domestic spaces, domestic playing. But what she argues in terms of trauma is fascinating, is really, really great. And what she says is, in much of the virtuosic moments of some of these pieces, she argues that those moments were written, at least she's interpreting as such, and whether or not it was intentional and intended to be so by the composer, as a way to convey the pain of warfare by having to play these very difficult passages, right? So it's a really fascinating thread of how she analyzes on the one hand, not so revolutionary or sophisticated music, but there are moments. I'm not a pianist, but even if I was, I probably couldn't play some of these things, but these passages. But her argument about in terms of conveying the pain or trauma through the physicality of playing the piano music in domestic spaces is a very important and fascinating insight. But then it was a way of reporting on the war, on the battles for domestic spaces, in addition to newspapers that people had access to, of course, but it was this music that also fulfilled that role as a way of spreading the news about battles. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. I'm just curious about the recordings themselves. What is this done specifically for this project, and who was narrating, I guess? Yes,
it was indeed. And let me go ahead and shout out my collaborators. So Dr. Charbel Yubale was the pianist, and Paul Hope was the narrator. And I was connected with them by Omar Herrera, who's a pianist as well. I believe all three, Paul Hope and Charbel Yubale, I believe are located in Houston, Texas. And Paul Hope is an actor, a stage actor. He's got a great voice. He's got just the perfect voice for the narration of this music. And of course, Dr. Yubale's playing it's a treat for me. It's just very. Without the recordings, I would not have been able to, I feel, engage with the music in the same way, especially along with the narration. So it was really it's a great privilege and very important for sort of how I was thinking about the music, without which I think this would have been a slightly different paper. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. Did I understand correctly earlier in your paper that there is a composition by a Mexican composer that it's kind of intriguing that this might exist somewhere and that you've heard traces of, but I was just wondering if you had learned anything else about that piece or that composer. It's just fascinating that there might be a perspective on this written from the Mexican perspective?
Yeah, so we're stumped. So first of all, the source. It's actually from a multi-volume collection, compiled and edited by Enrique de Olavarria y Ferrari. And the multi-volume collection is titled Reseña Histórica del Teatro en México, 1538 to 1911. And it's literally like 12 volumes. And so I have all the volumes of them stacked up on the floor in my office. And there's a reference on page 551, page 551 from the first volume. Which is, it's common in many of these sort of multi-volume I'm going to do the entire 19th century. His main sources were Mexican newspapers. And it was just a matter of just sort of compiling dates, names, places, and then moving on, but all chronologically ordered. And that's where the reference to La Gran Batalla de la Angostura, composed by Luis Pérez de León. Luis Pérez de León is actually a well-known mid-19th century Mexican composer who's published many pieces. Those pieces are readily available archivally and also have been published. And there are musicologists, John Lozano, for example, has written a lot about Luis Pérez de León. However, this particular piece, no one is aware of. And I've tried going back to Ferrari, he only mentions a Mexican newspaper indicates that, and I think he gives us the month, the month and the date. And in looking at all of at least the digital newspaper databases that I have of Mexican newspapers from the time, I've yet to find it, and some of my colleagues also have not been able to find it. So, but you're right. I would love to find one of the. I really have to go to Mexico and do some to at least try to find not only perhaps this piece but other pieces that we just don't know exist. Yeah. Thank you, Megan.